On the 7th of November, the Office of Tax Simplification posted part one, or published part one, of their review of inheritance tax. Now, it's really important when you consider what's in this review and what will be in part two, to remember the role of the Office of Tax Simplification. It was made clear to me by Paul Morton, the outgoing tax director of the OTS, at a conference we were both presenting at a little while back. The role of the OTS is to look at simplifying the journey for the customer, that is, making sure that the tax administration process is as smooth as it can be for taxpayers. And we're not purely restricted to administration. They will make recommendations around anything that can make the tax work better, basically. But their job isn't to fundamentally change tax policy. Okay, now it may be that tax policy is changed as a result of some of their recommendations, but that isn't their prime role. So that said, what's in part one? Part one clearly just looks at administration. They'll be looking at more technical issues in part two, which will be published sometime in 2019. So in the administration part, not a huge amount for financial planners to be concerned about. There's a great, as you'd expect, concentration on just what happens in relation to the payment process for inheritance tax. And so there's a lot of focus given to the forms, the completions of forms, the inheritance tax returns, and the general conclusion is it's too hard. The underlying thing is we need to make the completion of these forms, the whole process, more digital, to work better digitally. I mean, we have forms 205 and 400 as PDFs, which are difficult to complete, and all the rest of it makes it just more difficult than it should be. So as an overall principle, digitisation needs to be accelerated. There needs to be much better guidance, according to the OTS, to help people with the completion of these forms and the process generally, and to explain it. And in the meantime, because they accept anything digital takes a little bit more time, it's a much bigger project, look at those forms and see if they can be simplified. Now, what I found particularly interesting, and I know this has been the case for others I've spoken to, are the figures, the stats, the MI, published at the beginning of the report in the sort of exec summary part. Because apparently there are 550,000 deaths there were in the last tax year. Now, of those deaths, half of them, broadly speaking, required the completion of forms. So the other half didn't. Why is that? Because they didn't require probate. So they were small estates, accepted estates. Small estates. So things where assets were jointly owned, like your house, and then you had a small bank account, in which case joint tenancy rule says it goes automatically to the co-owner, doesn't have to go through it via your will. So basically where probate wasn't required. So the other half where probate was required, were required to complete forms. But, and here's the big but, out of those 250 odd thousand estates that were required to complete forms, 205 or 400, the bigger form, 205 being about 8 or 9 pages, 400 being could be significant number of pages. So of those 250 odd thousand, only 25,000 estates actually paid tax. So the underlying point there is, could we do better than that, says OTS? Because if out of there's 250,000 people having to complete forms, and I think it was on average, some people were saying it takes around 50 hours to complete even the simplest forms, because form filling is not something that people naturally go towards, especially if it's to do with tax. So 250,000 deaths, only 25,000 of them pay tax. Surely we can improve on that in relation to form filling. Connected with that, it's worth mentioning while I'm talking about this, in relation to probate, is that there are regulations that have been laid, are likely to come into force next year in relation to probate. Currently, no probate fee is required if your estate is less than £5,000, and if it is more than £5,000, there's a flat fee payable, and that is £165 if you use a lawyer or a qualified probate practitioner. And 215 if you do it yourself. On the premise, I suppose, it will be less good if you do it yourself. But there are the fees, relatively low flat fees. The court service said it actually costs quite a lot to run the probate service and the court service, so we need to get some more money. So we're going to change the system, the banded system, introduce a banded system. So good news is No probate fees required if your estate doesn't exceed £50,000. So that's quite a leap. However, there is also quite a leap in the fees payable, because they will then jump up from a few £100s to, if your estate is more than £2 million, the probate fee will be £6,000. So I think the premise is, well, you can afford it if your estate is more than £6 million. But as a percentage increase, I haven't worked it out, but from £165 or 215 to 6,000, that's quite a big percentage increase. So that's a small associated thing. So the Office of Tax Simplification review largely focused on administration. The more technical issues, they've had over 3,000 responses, will be next year. One would expect, because a lot of those responses were apparently to do with, there will be some changes around the or recommendations, because OTS doesn't make change, it makes recommendations for consideration. So around the residence nil rate ban, which is overly complex given its intent. So if the intent is no family worth more than £1 million should pay inheritance tax, if that's the intent, then surely you could achieve it a little simpler than introducing the incredibly complex residence nil rate ban. So that's a definite watch this space for next year, and the space to watch is of course TechLink.